Hey, thanks, Joe. Always appreciate this time of year and a lot of great, interesting data there. As usual, pretty much in the theme that Joe was talking about. The Upfront is always a highly watched event, and just to his point, it's going to get way more complicated this year. I'm sure all you media buyers and media executives know that that's the case, especially when it comes to what the last year was about. And in that regard, when it comes to the pandemic of last year and all that soaring connected TV data, well, we're going to get more of it now. And it's going to come more fast and furious, and it's going to be things that we need to synthesize and figure out what to do, not just for this upfront, but for the long term, which will come with Joe's panel. He'll explore that a little bit more. So, on top of all this, we have this sort of major, at least economic recovery and the question is, can the market bear this in terms of, as Joe referred to, potential rising pricing? First, the big CT data lurking in the room for all of us. 25% of all TV viewing time, according to Nielsen, is on streaming platforms, but only 4% of the advertising time is on streaming content. So we have Netflix and Disney Plus and all the rest of our upfront TV advertising decisions to be made even more complicated. At the same time, TV networks would like to have marketers do something even more, commit more of their upfront dollars, around 20 or 30%. All this primarily for their premium streaming apps. Networks are pressured to make sure that these new and somewhat now veteran businesses get off to a good start. And the list includes, as you might know, Hulu, Peacock, Paramount Plus, the forthcoming HBO Max advertising option, as well as Pluto TV and Tubi. And let's not forget the more aggressive digital players in the world lurking around also, YouTube Select, Roku, and Amazon. So we have a great panel here. It's going to help us make sense of all this, and I hope that all my panelists are up right now. Seems like they more or less are. Maureen Bosetti, Chief Partnerships Officer at Initiative. Gibbs Haljun, Total Investment Lead of GroupM's Mindshare. Jason Kanefsky, Managing Editor of Marketplace Intelligence, Havas Media. We'll see him right now, but maybe he'll join in a second here. John Muszynski, Chief Investment Officer of Publicis Media Exchange, and Cathy Shaffner, Chief Investment Officer of Empower. So, and also just to let you know, as Joe mentioned near the end of the panel, we're going to take audience questions that you can post in chat. So this question is going to go to Gibbs first. How concerned about you right now, Gibbs, about all this talk and all this estimates and projections about price inflation, like really bad price inflation? I mean, you were looking at basically SMI saying what, the first quarter scatter was up nearly 300% in broadcast. That doesn't bode well for pricing, at least for linear TV, for this upfront. What do you think?
Well, I mean, look, I think that SMI is a good tool. We obviously use it from a GroupM standpoint. SMI, the outputs of unit costs are based on what the ratings are as well as what the price is. So, inflation on unit cost doesn't necessarily translate to inflation in terms of overall CPMs. I think, when you look at the landscape, and if you are talking about a commodity marketplace, whatever our inflation is actually better than what soybean inflation is currently. If you look at global commodity prices, they've gone up significantly in the last year. And it's only natural. Like when you see the world coming out of a pandemic, out of, a repressed or depressed, sort of economic period, and you see greater economic growth, you tend to see prices go up. I think the bigger challenge isn't about sort of inflation, yes or no. I think it's about value, in that, if you look at the value in the linear landscape, network news delivers a higher average rating than primetime. And I think that's an interesting conundrum and more of a question about, is the value there for a primetime program particularly if it's delivering, under a 0.8 rating.
Hey, Maureen, do you think that, to Gibbs' point about that news especially, is that a factor, in terms of pricing considerations, especially what we saw last year when it comes to specific, programming content?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Gibbs's point, I don't think it's just about news. I think it's the fact that if you're going to pay a $60 CPM, are you getting the value for that CPM, and how are you going to recalibrate what is worth the prices relative to the audiences that you're delivering? And for some people, it may be news because that's the audience they're trying to reach. For others, it might be a show on TLC or HGTV, or it might be sports, or it might be cinema, or it might be YouTube. It's all relative to whatever audience you're trying to reach and what is the price you're willing to pay to reach that audience. So I think there definitely is value in different places, but it really goes back to, again, who you're trying to reach and are you going to get the right scale and audience composition through whatever platform you're trying to buy. So I don't think it's about pitting one against the other, but again, it's about what's the price you want to pay for that audience.
Right. John, basically, we had with pricing last year versus this year, does it kind of make sense, at least for you, that, if the economy is growing, that, CPMs are going to rise pretty much more than they were, obviously, versus last upfront?
Well, there's a huge part of this that nobody seems to want to talk about, at least from the sales side, and that is there are two pieces to the equation. There's supply and there's demand. And we all know that the supply on the linear side is down, and it's down tremendously. No one's talking about demand against these specific vehicles. They're talking about demand in general. And we need to understand this is a bifurcated market. We're going to have a very different market for linear television than we're going to have for digital market. And that has to be taken into account. And when everyone starts talking about these inflationary numbers, and we talk about scatter premiums, the only reason we had the kind of scatter premiums that we did was because of the lack of supply. We didn't see that situation on the digital side. So I get really nervous when everyone starts talking about the inflation in this marketplace and they're lumping everything into one bucket,
right,
when in fact we really have two very distinct marketplaces. And in fact, I would go as far as to say we have three, because within linear, you have a different set of supply and demand dynamics going on in sports. So when everyone just starts to talk about this in very general terms, it really, really concerns me, because we're playing into the hands of the seller at this point.
Got it. Cathy, are your clients worried about this?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with what everyone's saying. It really does come down to supply and demand. And yeah, our clients are worried, the value proposition in this conversation is going to be key. Reframing for clients how to think about the value of what they're paying for, and rethinking about how they're buying. You have to think about the demand is there because everything is coming back and inflation.
Okay.
So
we might have to come back to you. Your mic is a little off for us, but we're going to fix that. Jason.
So first of all, Cathy, that's a great background. Is that your kitchen, or what's going on back there? That's a great space. So I think two things. I think Gibbs talked about the soybean market, and I think we're also talking about a microchip market where we can make more soybeans. We can grow more soybeans, which will limit inflation. But I think the linear television world is a microchip market where we just don't have enough microchips. We can't make more microchips, and what you're going to see is that some just like Ford and Chrysler are having an issue with their with plants and closing plants, you're going to see an issue on the supply side on the television where there are going to be some who will get and then some that who won't get. So this is not going to be a typical market where the rate of inflation will be the same for every single client. I think you're going to have multiple rates of inflations across different quintiles that advertisers sell against. So this is not going to be a traditional market where a number gets set and then the market goes against it, I think it's going to be a number will be set for certain clients and a number will be higher or lower based on their historical base in the business.
Gibbs, so that kind of begs the question about, what I referred to earlier and what John was talking about, the digital part of this conversation. Obviously in years past, we tend to look at the upfront, the linear market pretty much primarily, but now we really have to take a broader, wider view. So, what do you make, how does this affect, in part, the whole price inflation issue when networks are demanding from your clients, 20 or 30% more money being shifted from, linear to their premium platforms?
Yeah, I think it is, John talked about sort of, 3 different markets. I would actually argue there's probably a 4th market. If you look at pharmaceutical as an advertiser, category, they've seen a lot of growth in the marketplace, but with long form creative, nobody wants long form creative on digital platforms. So that makes it even harder, in terms of how do we start shifting dollars around? I think it becomes really important to what, Cathy and Maureen and Jason were saying about, where do I find my audience? Why do I go after that audience? And how do I determine the value for that audience? That's even more important than a rating. You see it in the landscape where, networks are pushing for things like, adult 18 to 40, adult 18 plus guarantees, household guarantees. We're moving backwards. But you know what, if we don't have the tools to then determine what the value equation is by that shift, even if I'm buying a better audience, I may want to buy on an 18 plus CPM because I know that I'm going to get a better deal against my targeted demographic or targeted audience in that bucket of inventory. That's where it becomes really sort of interesting and important in terms of trying to find that. And I think, to Jason's point about finding more microchips, everybody on this panel is out looking for microchips. I think, the biggest challenge is that I don't necessarily know that I'm going to need one of these networks next year. I may have entirely new sources of inventory that we haven't even really tapped into at this point.
Yeah, Maureen, I guess that to that point, we've talked about this, that it's getting harder and harder to make estimates from networks. So, does the pricing dynamic, does the pricing equation change, especially when, if networks, to Gibbs' point, that now they have to guarantee, they won't be able to guarantee on 18 to 49 or 25 to 54. I mean, they can only guarantee on 18 plus. Does that mean your clients have to work harder to bring more of their first party data and trying to figure out what they can buy?
Well, again, I think it goes back to, if you take an audience first approach, you have to understand where your audiences are across every video platform. So it really starts with that. And we have more options than we've ever had before. So while yes, linear is down, yes, there's supply contraction, yes, in prime time in some of those places, we have plenty of other options, right? We've got, like you said, the Rokus, the Amazons, Samsung, YouTube, et cetera. So there are other opportunities and options for video. And so it is critical, obviously, that we are understanding all of the opportunities against those audiences and where we can find them. And then if for certain clients, it makes sense, and from a cost standpoint, to do an 18 plus guarantee, but knowing that we actually want to target against a high value audience and that cost value equation makes sense, we can convert to an 18 plus guarantee if that cost aligns. But we're not going to do it if there's a inverse relationship and the cost is going up dramatically. So I think for us, it's all about understanding what those audiences are and what the best value is to find those across any video screen. It's not starting with television, it's definitely finding them across everywhere. And there's a lot of opportunity out there to find those audiences and to do it in a more efficient way, to be honest, a much more efficient way.
Hey, John, did last year's or the current season's, really horrible, I guess, make good situation we haven't seen in a few years, vis-a-vis what happened with the pandemic, what happened with production and networks unable to figure out, where they were going to sit this year. How is that situation right now? Has it gotten better in terms of the deficiency from last Upfront?
Well, if you're talking about having more original programming, I think that is on the uphill battle. They're doing a better job there, but they're still sort of recovering from what they've had in the past. But I think the key thing there is not necessarily can they produce the same number of original hours that they've produced in the past, but it's how has the consumer's behavior changed during the pandemic. And we all know that, you know, behavior change, the accelerated acceptance of different streaming products and getting access to other content, some of which is not ad supported, has played a major part in the ratings that the networks are delivering. And thus one of the reasons that, you know, they're anticipating that they're getting into that business so that they can take advantage of the new consumer behavior. And that's why I think, you know, everyone, and I'm going to go back to the whole supply and demand, and everyone's talking about inflation. I don't know, has anyone seen my budgets? Do you know if my budgets are down? You know,
Gibbs says he has.
raising his hand, but the fact of the matter is, I think there's going to be a big surprise in this marketplace when you start to look at where linear budgets are. They're not going to be up. Budgets will be up, but the linear budgets are not. And if you're actually following the consumer, there's going to be less demand against the linear product. Now, the problem is the shortfall in supply is greater than the decrease in demand. But everyone is assuming that we keep talking about this demand being up. Demand is up in certain areas and actually flat or down in others. And we've got to take that into account.
I'd like to, Wayne, if I could just comment, you know,
No problem.
follow up on John's comment. I think the thing that's really interesting is that, you know, you have all of these outlets from a digital platform standpoint. You know, there are a couple of platforms to get NFL live in-game content, you know, and it's, you know, essentially a couple days a week. From a digital content, you know, the distribution channels of TV everywhere has literally flooded the marketplace with options. And it's not just content everywhere, but, you know, distributors or content owners have put their content on multiple platforms. So, but it's also like, so I can get it on multiple platforms, whether it's Tubi, whether it's Zumo, whether it is Pluto, et cetera, Amazon, Facebook, YouTube, et cetera. So what you've done is you've created this aperture where content and audience is everywhere. So I don't necessarily need a individual network's digital extension at a premium because I can buy it at a discount from 14 different places. You know, the idea of restricted content or or sort of walled content doesn't really exist because it's on every platform and therefore it's not unique. Therefore, I'm going to look to get the best value I can. And if that means one year I do a deal with partner X and the next year I shift all my money to partner Y, I may do that. And the other challenge is that YouTube and Amazon would ask for every one of our single dollars and be able to deliver it without a problem. Now, I'm not saying I want to give YouTube or Amazon all of my money, but they're asking for it.
I know. Hey, Jason, are they asking for your money? YouTube?
Well, they've been asking for it for 5 years. So I think the big shift that we've had though is that, you know, consumers used to chase content, right? And they would find the content on platforms that they liked. And what we're seeing now is that content is chasing consumers. And that's, you know, creating a completely different, you know, algorithm for some of these vendors where they're trying to figure out where do they put their best content? Do they put it on HBO Max or do they put it on TBS? Does it go to NBC first or does it go to Peacock? And what we're seeing is that if you're under the age of 50, the broadcast networks are not necessarily, they're not, I was being kind, they're not your first destination. You know, on Sunday night, if you posted out the Academy Awards, they had $1 million cost per point against adults 18 to 49, $1 million. So I don't know how that math works on an ROI, but it can't be good. But, you know, the point you're talking about supply, The supply is not coming back. The reason why the networks are going adults 18 plus is because they're looking at the crystal ball going, if we try to sell on any other demographic, we can't make it work. So that's why they're going to adults 18, adults 18 plus.
Hey, Cathy,
Yeah.
so.
Can you hear me now, Wayne?
Yes, I hear you. Good.
Good.
Your mic is doing great now. Thanks. So, I mean, are you going to buy more Tubi and Pluto TV in the coming years vis-a-vis what Gibbs was talking about? I mean, is that where, if that's necessary to get, the content you need? When we're just talking about, that content, rerun, whatever, is that
Right.
more important?
Yeah, I mean, it is about following the content, right? If you're going to follow the consumer, you got to follow the content. And when you get into this whole conversation that we've been having today about supply and demand, the supply is down and the demand is up, but the supply has grown. We can go get that content in many more places, right? And so, yeah, we do look to spend dollars in additional places, in addition to what we're doing in the linear space. And we're looking to buy the linear space differently and add in different players and more YouTube and Tubi and Pluto and stuff, just to follow the content, because that's how we have to match and reach those consumers. And then Maureen said something interesting a while back too. It's just, it's really all about that audience. And so how you deploy into each one of those buys that you do and the audience that you reach, that's going to bring the value, right? If the CPM is higher in some areas that you're going to, and you're reaching the audience you need, we have to help the brands understand that the value is there and get away from just this one-to-one comparison of 20, 30, 40% increases in CPMs.
Got it. Hey, Maureen, I want to switch gears just a little bit here, because we like to get your side of the story concerning, a lot was made in the last 2 weeks, the VAB and their network members about the undercounting of viewers due to the lack of maintenance in Nielsen panel homes in the last several quarters. Now, Nielsen says as of March, they went back into the homes to do the maintenance. So I guess things are going to get better. How do you see this affecting, if at all, the upfront?
Well, I don't think it's going to affect the upfront much. I don't think there's going to be a big impact on that. I
Okay.
think the ratings are down. I think if there's some adjustments being made for the future, I don't think it's going to have a material impact for the future. We're certainly not going backwards, but I don't think it will have a material impact because I think viewership is down. And I don't think this adjustment is going to material impact what the supply will be moving forward. So I don't see it having too much of an impact for the future, just because I think the ratings aren't going to change too much. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on supply.
So it's just the networks, doing
Yeah,
what they did.
it's posturing.
Came to the out-of-home thing last year, right? I mean, they were just, so upset whether or not it was, it wasn't going to be in Nielsen's data, and that, especially for sports, that would really lower ratings, I would imagine, right? That was the issue.
Correct. I mean, it was a way to get more supply back into the currency, and there was no option. We had it's only one stream, and it's in.
Yeah.
And it was, basically a very challenging discussions, I would say, with that around out of home.
Right.
And we had we were left with little to no options, but it was a way to add supply back in, certainly for sports and some other day parts. It helped to an extent. It helped the networks from a supply standpoint, but yeah, that was a challenging discussion, I would say, and one that I don't see this issue impacting it too much from a large standpoint.
Yeah, I'll just chime in, Wayne. I agree with Maureen. I don't think there's much of an issue there, much validity. I mean, at the end of the day, the ratings are still down, and I think a lot of it's going to be posturing on how to garner those larger CPMs, and so I think that's how it's going to be used. But I don't think it's going to really be a factor.
Yeah,
I think what's going to be a bigger factor is the way they're going to start measuring streaming. That's going to be a bigger factor than what's happening with the panels.
That will be a much bigger issue. Yep.
Yeah, as they start to, where they have 9 million set up now to be in 9 million homes to measure streaming like they do linear TV with the set-top box. And I think that's going to have a bigger impact on how we're negotiating than, the panels weren't right. But yeah, I agree with Maureen on that one.
Okay. Just another note, if people have questions, you can leave in the chat. We'll pick it up. and Joe will come in to help us here when we have it. John, concerning, all this money in theory moving to CTV, OTV in the upfront, how much of a concern is it going forward, because there's still a lot of issues around fraud. Maybe, I don't know if it's more so or less so, but it keeps on popping up. I mean, to a sizable degree. What, if anything, can you do of that? And, does it slow down your impetus to move more money to these digital spaces?
Well, I think it has in the past, but I think this past year in the change that we've seen with the consumer in terms of their viewing behavior, I think has reinforced the fact that these are viable options. Are they perfect? No, but they are viable options. And it's clear that traditional linear programming, it doesn't have the same viewership that it did before. And I forget who made the comment about if you're 50 years of age or younger, your first choice is not going to be one of the traditional network linear options.
Right.
So, we know the consumer is in fact consuming that content in a streaming fashion, and we have to be there. We have to follow them, or result in the ridiculous, cost increases that everyone is foolishly talking about.
Right. Got it. A couple of years ago, Jason, A&E kind of made a little news with us, actually at the Upfront, if I remember correctly, talking about possible business outcome guarantees. That always seemed to complicate it. It seemed a great premise, and a tremendous reach out to people in the advertising community. But you wonder about attribution issues aside, how much of that is important in your decision making, when your agency is doing upfront deals this year?
So I think A&E is the presenting sponsor. So I want to acknowledge that.
You're right. There you
Good
go.
job, guys. So your business outcome is spectacular at this point for A&E. I think that business outcomes are so hard to capture, and with a bifurcated media marketplace that we have, where you have upper funnel, lower funnel activity going on, I think you're hard pressed to actually prove that a business outcome was actually generated from a specific spot.
Right.
It's just by way of example, we have one of our clients who switched their ROI modeling firm in mid-year, and we got completely different results from the previous modeling firm. So I think it's a great opportunity if a client can manage against it, but I think it's a little bit still far off in terms of reality.
Gibbs, we have a question from Adam Straub. OTT and CTT are often used synonymously. Should publishers be charging separate rates for CTV impressions versus mobile? Are they all premium long-form impressions? Are all premium long-form impressions equal to CTV?
It is CTV, OTT obviously are used, sort of across the board. I think we like to think of it as CTV plus, because, there's the whole concept of what's on a screen, but if I'm mirroring from my phone to my Apple TV to then my screen, is it really a mobile impression or is it a TV impression? I think it really comes down to, sort of the premiumness of the content and what that content is. And again, that's going to differ by age category. So if you look at an 18 to 34-year-old or, my 17-year-old son, YouTube is premium content, regardless of what that content is. It's not, even if it's not professionally produced, it is still considered premium content to him. I think the reality is, if it is too cheap to be true, it probably is too cheap to be true. Like, buy, from a consumer standpoint, we buy quality goods, and media should be no different. If you think the premium or the lack of premium on an impression is too good to be true, it probably is at the end of the day.
Okay, we have another question from Jennifer D'Alessandro. To the point of fraud and expanding for quality content. We would love to hear thoughts on working with publishers direct versus platforms in the CTV space to bring you as close to the content as possible. So her issue is publishers direct versus other platforms in the CT space. I guess in terms of preferences. No?
I think we do both. I think we have to do both. I don't know that it's either or, because we want to work with the platforms because there's scale there. And quite honestly, we can't work with, right? You can't buy all individual publishers and going publisher direct. So we look at it as both, because I think there's reason to buy the platforms, and then there's reason why you might want to go directly to a Hulu or an ESPN, et cetera, to buy those individual content. So, but I think there's value in going both ways, and I don't think it's going to be an either or scenario. It's just, and especially if you want to do audiences, we also want to be able to buy programmatically. So you have to be able to have the multiple ways in from a buying standpoint that are obviously going to give you the best, if you want to buy content versus just going after audiences and being as efficient as you can, we need to have multiple options.
I just want to reiterate to what, Maureen said. I think part of the challenge in terms of doing that is if I can only access the content one way, then that enables the direct relationship. But if you're going to give me the ability to access that content through 15 different pipes and 4 different, DSPs or sellers, that then makes it, less close to it regardless, because you've now opened it up for basically everybody.
Got it. One thing I was listening to in some of the upfront meetings that were made earlier was that, I think Viacom, CBS, and maybe the others too, all believe that they can sort of make up for the lost rating points with digital inventory. And in that regard, obviously they're creating their own sort of almost walled gardens, mimicking what Google and Facebook have. How much of an issue is that? That seemingly, at least on, supply side, that they kind of want to, put themselves sort of like siloed from everyone else, and maybe with their own metrics. That's a question to anyone.
From a group standpoint, I need fewer walled gardens and fewer silos. Like measuring how inventory and performance is within your one world is fine, but it's not really how we buy. Like I don't buy one partner, we buy lots of different partners. And so, there's a lot of talk and working through different opportunities to measure the full ecosystem. And I think that's what, we're striving for to continue to push forward. But because measuring one thing doesn't necessarily mean that is the be all end all.
Right. Cathy, same thinking?
Yeah, same thinking. I think it's really going to come down to the measurement. And you asked the question, you started with, they're going to be making up the shortfall in one place or the other. It's not really making it up or replacing it. It's just added to it. And how we measure it, how we track within walled gardens or outside of walled gardens through all of the new technology that's available to us is just going to become key as we follow that content.
Right.
But I agree with him. It's all about the measurement. I think the interesting thing is going to happen as everything starts to bifurcate and do that is how budgets get reset. How do we think about a budget now for linear that includes CTV or OTT or digital extensions versus digital budgets? I think that's where the big challenge is going to come in.
Jason, there was a question regarding from Jessica O'Brien. Is there concern with content duplication then? Running on the same content with various partners.
Right. So I think it's not necessarily content duplication that concerns me. It's the frequency capping. Mm-hmm. And, how do we get control of how many times we've reached, this specific audience? And we talk a little bit more about, the programmatic pipes. We have a little bit more control that way because we can do frequency capping. But, the reality is that, as AVOD becomes more important and, other platforms become more, more emboldened and have larger budgets, we're going to lose control of how many times you've reached an audience. And that becomes, an area of waste that if we don't control for it, then we're just, we're going to create an ecosystem that's overspent against and, create supply problems there as well.
John, here's a question from Meredith Bivens. Following audiences from linear to streaming does mark a significant change in the CPM and movement from demo to P2 plus and advanced audience targeting. How quickly are your clients adopting to those steep increases and changes in pricing?
Well, I think I'm going to go back to one of the outcomes from the pandemic was an acceleration of changing consumer patterns, but also in client understanding and belief in the fact that the landscape has in fact changed. So we have seen great acceptance from our client base. They understand that it is not the landscape that we all, worked within 3, 4, or 5 years ago. It is dramatically different. And with that, change has to take place. So when we're looking at the way that they're shifting dollars, we see a clear shift towards these other more targeted, more strategic options that are available to us. And in turn, not only can we create a more competitive environment from a price standpoint, but we can also we can create a more strategic look at delivering our targets and moving away from 18 to 49. And I'm not suggesting going to 18 plus. I'm saying moving from an age and gender to more of a strategic behavioral target where we actually have the data overlays that we can put in place. So it's not as easy a comparison of, price for linear versus price for digital. There are other values that come with moving to these other platforms that allow us to do a better job of reaching our individual clients' targets.
Maureen, Dave Morgan on MediaPost writing column believes that what really needs to be done is to maximize even more optimization of linear TV. Obviously, it's coming from his perspective, and we understand that. How much, of what remains looking at the traditional upfront when it comes to, maybe getting even more out of linear TV? Is there anything left to get?
Well, I think we're looking at it more like we believe the incremental reach is coming outside of TV. But most of it, you're building frequency, right? You're just continuing to build frequency in a lot of ways. Sure, I think there's probably small gains if you go deeper in the linear TV list.
Right.
You can probably make small incremental gains, but you can be more efficient from an incremental reach standpoint once you start moving beyond linear and shifting that into whether it's OTT, CTV, digital video, social video. That's where you're going to start to make, you can build your reach more efficiently outside of linear. I think sure. Is there small incremental gains in linear? Sure, depending on your target, depending on how you're buying right now, depending on your audience. But we're seeing that, again, the incremental gains are coming outside of linear.
Right, got it.
If you're optimizing against total reach.
Gibbs, obviously one of the key selling points of CTV is the 4 minutes per hour of ads around there for the streaming platforms. Obviously there are, to what Jason was saying, there's a whole bunch of other, issues regarding frequency, but what, does that provide limitation for you, or, given the amount of content on these streaming platforms or what the legacy media companies can put on them, does that sort of, weight back to, add more overall GRP weight or whatever to CTV? I mean, or does, or 4 minutes an hour just an attractive thing?
So, 4 minutes an hour is attractive from a consumer experience standpoint. I think that's much better than obviously 15, 16 minutes an hour.
Right.
The difference is that you still have frequency caps. Like, nobody is really frequency capping linear television. So if you are on a movie during a week or whatever, you could, in theory, particularly amongst cable rotation, see the same spot 3 or 4 times within a 2-hour block. The
Right.
frequency caps on all of the more digital centric properties limit that to a certain extent. Obviously, when you start going cross publisher on something like a Hulu, you can then, sort of see that change a little bit, or even a Roku for that matter. But yeah, that does make it attractive, but it also limits what you can actually spend on an individual platform, on a brand, on a per day standpoint. So that, will then narrow the focus or narrow the opportunity from an impression delivery standpoint.
Got it. Jason, what do you think as a logical, reasonable estimate about how much money really will flow to CTV this year? You have any sort of guess yet, or roughly?
I have not guessed that number yet, to be honest. I did a little bit of work on HBO Max in terms of how much money they can take. And, a lot will depend on how much goes from SVOD to AVOD. And when you start thinking about let's say there are 45 million homes with SVOD service, how many of those 45 million homes will downgrade to AVOD to save $8 or $9, depending on, what the price point. And then you start building out the model saying, okay, if there's, if 50% are willing to downgrade from $15 to $7.50, how many impressions does that generate? And that starts to create the model on how much money you can start moving. But we talked about YouTube before. The number on YouTube is infinite. They have plenty of impressions to go around. There's no question about that.
Right. Okay. This question comes from none other than Peter Olson of A&E. Do you all agree that the transition to 18 plus more easily enables a transition to a conversation around true strategic targets and ROI focus? And he says at the end, 18 plus isn't the end game. John,
I think it's a starting point. I think it creates a conversation with clients about changing where they're going. I think there are challenges from a client standpoint, particularly when you look at CPG, who are one step removed from that consumer experience where they're, transact in that sort of middle ground. And it does push that, but I think it's about understanding where the true target or who the true target is, understanding how to reach them, but also, again, you need commonality across everything, so that if we're dealing with 7 different walled gardens and 7 have a slightly different definition, then you might as well just stick with the demo, because it's going to be an average of an average of an average anyway. So might as well stay true with what you know.
Cathy, what do you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. When you talk about 18 plus,
Right.
That fundamentally is not in anybody's best interest other than the sales, houses. They're monetizing the 55 plus version of their audience, which is, as I get closer and closer to that, I do feel like we are important. But this is a mathematical formula that drives more benefit to the vendors than it does the clients.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because it helps them on the front end of selling, but also helps them on the back end and delivery, right? In the ADU problem and we owe and being able to deliver the ADU on 18 plus is going to be very advantageous to them. So, but if it does, I do agree, while it's more advantageous to the seller, it does open up the conversation about how to use linear TV from a top of the funnel strategy if you're going to be buying it against a broader demo, and being able to focus those CPMs and those audiences, in that consumer journey down to the middle or the bottom of the funnel. So I think it plays both ways, but I do agree with Jason that primarily it is going to be a sell side tactic that's going to be driving the upfront.
Because by changing the demographic is not going to magically make adult 18 to 49 appear.
Right. Yep.
So John, you agree with that?
Yeah, and I guess I missed the email that said we're in the transition going to adults 18 plus.
Yes. Thanks, John.
We're in the posturing for that.
I see it right now.
I don't remember agreeing to that.
We're in the posturing transition part.
So there's no transition yet. Obviously, Peter was obviously tweaking things to move along, I guess, from where they are now.
So, Wayne, I would say in this regard, and I've had this conversation with Peter, so this is not going to come to us as a surprise, but if you want to move me to an age and gender demo that I don't want to be at, if I wanted to be at 18 plus, I'd be there already.
Mhm.
So if I'm going to move to something else and help you deliver your guarantees easier because you don't have the 18 to 49-year-olds, then I would like something that moves my client closer to their true target. Because in very few cases, our clients' true targets are not 18 to 49. There's something other than that. And if we can take the available data that is now available to us and become smarter about delivering more of our clients' targets, and at the same time help our sales partners deliver their guarantees, I'm all for that. But we have to get closer to our clients' targets rather than just helping them through a difficult situation and not being able to deliver your guarantees because you're not relevant to adults 18 to 49.
Yeah, I'm going to tag on to that, John, because I think it's not only help us get closer to our targets, but this is where the incentivizing us to do that will come into play in the upfront. And what else can we bring? We can use this to our advantage on smaller rate of change, or being able to get into some of the digital extensions with a closer closed delta between the CPMs of linear and their digital extension. So I think to your point, John, if that's what they need help, publishers need help from us to help them close the gap on delivery, then it's going to have to be a win-win in both. And we're going to have to look to how we can help reach our audiences better. It's going to have to be incentivized to do it.
So Maureen, sort of tougher, we have like a minute or so to go here. Last question, because, obviously big pronouncements by big marketers, always kind of get my ear for the moment anyway. When, P&G's Mark Pritchard said that the upfront maybe not being as viable marketplace in the coming years. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I feel like we've been saying that for years.
Right. Okay.
And, I think that, again, buying in a long-term fashion is valuable, right?
Right.
Because there is, especially when it comes to areas where there is limited supply, and if you want to buy the inventory in a long-term fashion to help you plan out your year, and you can get efficiencies, and you have all of that laid out, there's benefits to doing that. So I don't think it's necessarily about why we want to buy in a long-term fashion. I think it's the model that needs to change, and how we do it, and the mechanics of it, and the flexibility, this idea of buying by day part. Like, there's a lot of things we can change in the model and how we do it. But I don't think the concept of buying long-term is necessarily negative, because it has been benefiting us for a very long time. And I think there are efficiencies in the way we buy, and there's certainly benefits to doing that in a world where if there is any pressure on supply, it's warranted in the way that we do it. I just think we have to change how we do it.
Gibbs? No.
Yeah, sorry, I was getting off mute. No, I agree. I think there's a long-term value. There's a reason people sign 1 and 2 and 3 year leases, because they don't want to move on a month-to-month basis. Like, there are a lot of resources that go in to moving on a regular basis. There are a lot of resources that go into, buying long-term. There are, nobody is really talking about how to change the way shopper and retail marketing is. That's done on an even longer time frame than we do, video negotiation. So, there's value there because it provides a value and price benefit for everybody to then be able to plan their businesses. I do agree with Maureen that there's a way to change it, and that we should be looking at it in a different point of view, particularly to be able to tap into current trends or new things, or the latest, greatest thing, opportunity, et cetera. And I think that's what we should be focusing on in terms of evolving the marketplace.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. That's about all the time we have. Now, and I appreciate, I want everyone to stand up and give a standing ovation. No, we hear the clapping.